Hi, my name's Gavin Haverstick with Haverstick Designs.
And I'm Ryan Brinkworth.
And this is the S.O.U.N.D Project.
All right, so today we're going to talk about room dimensions and room ratios and how that affects a space.
Yeah.
So that's one of those things that, especially when we're doing a new studio from the ground up, one of the first things that we'll do is a room layout. And that allows us, before even talking about acoustical treatment, we're able to kind of figure out some of the frequency issues by just the design of the room and the measurements of the room. So do you want to focus and talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, the design of your room really impacts the overall sound quality of the space. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't mean that you can't combat some of the issues in a bad room size with acoustical treatment, but you can also make your job a lot easier by doing it right the first time. Yeah. Now, I will say up front that most people don't have the ability just to magically build their own room. They're given, an extra spare bedroom to work with, and you're not going to be doing extra construction. So I get that, and so don't feel like if these room ratios, your rooms don't fall perfectly in here. If that's means that there's no hope for your room. That's not the case. It's something where if you do have the ability to build from the ground up or make some minor adjustments to your room, there's some ways to set yourself on the right foot so that you don't have as many low frequency issues.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So with that being said, is there a set standard that we should follow when we're talking about deciding room dimensions?
Yeah, there's been a lot of research done on this topic by people a lot smarter than me that spent years of their life, working on just this room ratio issue.
Mm-hmm.
There's people like Bolt and S.O.U.N.D and Sepmeyer and Bonello, like people that have really dug into this and come up with some kind of standards.
Sure.
Now, it's very subjective of what people think about these different ratios and which ones people prefer. But I would say that if you choose one of these types of ratios, then you're probably going to end up with a pretty good result. I've got a graphic here on the screen that just shows some of the different ratios that are out there. Like the first one here by Richard Bolt is 1 to 1.5 to 2.5. And to explain these ratios, typically the 1 in the ratio, a lot of times it ends up being the ceiling height, okay? Because it's usually the shortest dimension in your room because the length and the width end up being a little bit longer. It's not always the case, but that's usually how it goes. And so if, for instance, your room had 10-foot ceilings, let's say, to make the math easy. So 10 would be what the 1 ratio is. So the 1.5 dimension would be 1.5 times 10. So it'd be 15 feet. And then the 2.5 number would be 25 feet. So the room would end up being 10 foot by 15 foot by 25 foot if you went by Bolt's ratio and you had a 10-foot ceiling. But there's a lot of variables in here, and like what people's ceiling height, sometimes 10 feet's a luxury for a lot of people. Like if they can get 9 feet, that's actually really nice. Sometimes in basement studios, we're talking about 7.5, 8-foot ceilings. And so that's going to skew these numbers a little bit. So Bolt's ratio ended up being 1 to 1.5 to 2.5. S.O.U.N.D is 1 to 1.4 to 1.9. Bonello is 1 to 1.26 to 1.59. And then Sepmeyer is 1 to 1.4 to 1.39. And within that, they didn't come up with just one ratio. There's a lot of different ratios that they've come up with that are good. But the main thing here that you're dealing with is trying to make sure that the length, width, and height play well with each other. Mm-hmm. It's not just as simple as just let's find the biggest room I can put my studio in. There's a lot more involved with that. To dig a little bit deeper into the Bolt research that Richard Bolt had done, he came up with this thing called the Bolt area, which this graph here shows the, let me get my pen out here. This graph shows the length on the y-axis and then the width on the on the x-axis. And then there's this kind of shape here, this little oblong shape that's within the graph. And ideally, you would want your room dimensions, your room ratios to fall somewhere within that shape. Mm-hmm. Okay, so what you do is we're assuming that the height is the 1.0, but then you go in here and you say, okay, if it's 1.0 and my width was 1.4, and then you go up and my length is 1.6, that falls right about there on your graph. That's within the Bolt ratio. Yep. But if you fall out like somewhere out here or somewhere out here, you're probably going to struggle a little bit more with some low frequency issues just because your room dimensions aren't playing well with each other.
Sure.
Another great resource for people is this website. It's amacoustics.com, and there's this amroc room mode calculator. And we're going to study room modes a lot more in a future episode. But I'm going to click over to this website to show you how it's used. So it's easy to just put in a length, width, and height, and then you're able to see a mode distribution. But then also, I'll scroll down, and you'll be able to see the bolt area. So if I scroll down a little bit down here in the right, there's this bolt area, that shape that I showed you before, and you can just play with some dimensions. So if we look at something like a room that's 21 foot by 17 feet by 10 foot, let's say, and we hit enter, notice that red X falls inside the shape, right? And so that is typically a pretty good result.
Yeah.
Now, if we just change one thing about this room, like let's say we were able to get 3 more feet extra in our house to be able to build the room a little bit longer, and we're excited about having more space in our room. If we do that and hit enter, now it's outside of that bolt ratio, that bolt area. And so we want to, it's a good kind of guidelines if you're testing out room shapes and sizes, going through a calculator like this, and this will become even more helpful when we talk about room modes in the future episode. Yep. But this calculator is really great. A lot of visual things that will tell you a lot about your room.
Sure. So as you go through these ratios, and even as some of our clients may go through these ratios, what are some good kind of weak links, I guess, that people may see, or that they may not have control over, I guess?
Well, I think the main one is just your ceiling height. Everyone's limited by ceiling height. We just got done filming a little while ago a video for Brooklyn Duo that's up on our YouTube page, and they have 17-foot ceilings, and it's like people would kill for that. It's like that's something that you typically don't get that type of flexibility. So usually that ceiling height is going to be your limiting factor in this room mode, and you think about it, if 8 is your number there, you're multiplying that by 1.4 or 1.6, and that's kind of like the ratio you should get. Now, so if you have a low ceiling and then really long lengths and a decent width, you're probably going to fall outside the bolt area, and you might have some more additional problems that a room that fell within the bolt area would not have.
Sure.
Yeah.
So if someone were wanting a rectangular space, just most ideal situation, what are some good room dimensions that someone would look for?
Okay, so when it comes to rectangular rooms, the thing about rectangular rooms is that a lot of times they get a bit of a bad rap, because people are always just like, hey, don't build a rectangular room because the walls are parallel, and then you have these room mode issues and all of that. And that's true, but when it comes to rectangular rooms, is that they're ultra predictable. Like you know how they're going to perform. You can do room mode calculators very easily, figure out where your frequency issues are, and then plan accordingly.
Sure.
Whereas when you start to angle walls and ceilings and things like that, it gets a little bit more complicated on the prediction side. I mean, it's things like acoustical consultants like ourselves can handle. Yep. But if you're building it by yourself and you don't know what impact the angling of walls and ceilings and floors are going to be, then that's going to be a little bit more of a challenge,
sure.
But it's definitely something you can work through. Looking at rectangular rooms, though, if you wanted to come up with, let's say, some good dimensions and bad dimensions, one thing I always tell people is try to think in prime numbers. Try to think of dimensions that are not divisible by the same number or each other.
Sure.
And so I brought up a graphic here that kind of shows some good dimensions and bad dimensions. So one example of good dimensions is for kind of a smaller bedroom size studio is 11 foot by 13 foot by 9 foot. And the reason that's good is because none of those numbers, 11, 13, or 9, are divisible by the same number. They're all going to be something where you can't divide it in by 3 or 2, and so it's just a really great set of numbers. So if you found a bedroom that size, I would choose it. Reminds me of a story like when my wife and I were choosing our first house. Like we had a bunch of different floor plans. We built our first starter home, and most of new homes, all the bedrooms are 10 by 12, 12 by 14. Everything's divisible by 2 or 4 because they're trying to be as most efficient as possible with drywall coming in 4-foot wide sheets.
Sure.
They're trying to make it easy for the constructability of it. But we ran across a floor plan that was had a second bedroom that was 11 by 15 by 8, and I was like, this is our house because that's my studio, you know? And so we ended up going with that house, and we liked other aspects of the house. It wasn't just the studio that drew us to it, but it's good to pick good dimensions like that and make decisions. Like if you're moving to a new house, think about that when you're choosing where your studio is going to go.
Absolutely.
So bad dimensions, if 11 by 13 by 9 is good, another room that's not too far off from that is 10 by 14 by 8. You know, it's about the same size. However, those are bad dimensions because they're all divisible by 2. And it's something that is going to cause low frequency issues. At certain frequencies are going to build up and cancel out even more than they would in a different size space.
Sure.
This next one down below, good dimensions, 5 by 7 by 9. I recommend that size for a vocal booth size all the time because they're really great dimensions. The room sounds pretty amazing for a small size room. And if you don't have a 9-foot ceiling height, you can switch that up. It could be 5 by 9 by 7 if you only have a 7-foot ceiling height. But 5 by 7 by 9 for a vocal booth is awesome. 4 by 6 by 8. Just don't do it, right? It's if you can avoid it. And sometimes people will ask me. One time I went to a guy's house, and he built a 4-foot by 4-foot by 8-foot vocal booth, and he's like, "How do I treat this thing?" And I was like, "A bulldozer. I don't know. Like just tear it down and start over." You know, if you can think at the very beginning of the project, like if you have any sort of control over the room dimensions, it's good to think in this lens right here.
Sure. We've talked about room dimensions. What are some things to take into consideration when we're talking about the shape of the room?
Yeah, the shape of the room can be equally important as the dimensions itself, because the way sound bounces around the room, you want to try to avoid like focusing and flutter echo and all sorts of fun things that happen in these small rooms. One thing I will say as far as something to avoid, I brought up a graphic here of a concave surface. Concave surfaces and acoustics don't mix very well. I mean, they create some pretty interesting phenomenon and kind of fun to listen to, but when it comes to a studio environment or any sort of like sound critical space, you just want to avoid concave surfaces. And the reason for that is that when sound waves go towards a concave surface here, every sound that hits that concave surface gets focused to a center of the radius of curvature. And that's kind of the reason you see on NFL sidelines, you see the clear plexiglass domes. They have a microphone actually facing the center of that dome, so they capture more sound energy as it hits that dome. It gets focused to the microphone, and it can help them pick up like really sensitive sounds on the field. But in studios, we don't want that kind of focusing. Like you also hear it a lot of times, like at the rear wall of a church or auditorium that's curved, you'll hear a focusing come back to the stage where it sounds like 50 of your voices speaking. Or we did a classroom once that was a classroom in the round. It was totally circular. The professor stood in the center of the room and addressed the students that were sitting in desks around them, and it just did not work, conceptually. And we had to go in and do some things to fix that. I used to live in Las Vegas when I was in high school, and the Hard Rock Casino there had a bar in their casino area where there was a dome on the ceiling above the bar. And if you sat on one side of the bar, there's someone 50, 60 feet away from you, it sounded like their voice was right here by your ear. Like it just focuses all that energy. So if you can avoid concave surfaces, I would recommend it. Now, I will say that convex surfaces are fine. Yeah,
Sure.
Most people don't build convex surfaces in their studios because it takes up valuable floor space,
Right.
because it's going to cut into the room. But if you're going to curve a surface, try to make it convex instead of concave, because the same thing happens here. We got sound traveling towards the convex surface, but instead of focusing to a center point, it actually scatters the sound like a diffuser would to different areas. And pushing it back into the room. So
Sure.
Convex is okay, concave, no go. The other thing to think about with angling walls and ceilings in your room, you can certainly make improvements by doing so, but there are certain things you can actually make a problem worse if you angle it incorrectly. So it's you don't want to just arbitrarily angle surfaces, because sometimes it can have a negative effect on your sound. I want to go through a couple examples here. These are identical shaped rooms as far as from left to right. Just one of them's flipped 180 degrees. Okay, and what we're showing here is a mixed position. We've got a mixed position here, right here in this location, here in that location, and you got two speakers in each room, and they're firing at the mixed position. And what I want to talk about is that even though it's the exact same shape and size of room, where you set up your equipment is super important. Yeah. And what you want to do is avoid sound focusing back to your listening position. So in this case, I've got another graph here that shows that the one on the left is the way you should set up, and the one on the right is you should try to avoid. The reason for that is if you look at the ray tracing that's happening, so we put a source right here at this location. And then you see all these blue lines that are bouncing around within the room and coming back to the microphone, which is placed at the listening position. But the way that these sidewalls are angled out like this, sound that hits that surface is going to be directed towards the back of the room, rather than if you look on the room on the right, sound that hits this surface is actually focusing back at the listening position. Mm-hmm. And what you want to do is guide that energy away from you, because you can treat the back of the room, you can put panels and bass traps and diffusers, whatever you want to in the back of the room. Right. But if that sound is being focused back to you, then that's not a great thing. So in this case, same size room, but it's better to set up in the short side and fire the long direction with the walls angling out. So you're trying to guide that sound towards the back of the room.
Sure.
We have another example here. Imagine having a basement studio or basement area in your house, and you've got kind of an L-shaped room where you might be going around some stairs or something like that. Sure. And you've got the one on the left where you place the mixed position there, where you've got this kind of a alcove pocket that's over to the right. And then over here, you're set up with more in the center here, where that pocket ends up being in the back of the room. With this one, we actually want to set up like the right side. And the reason for that is because you have symmetry at your mix position. Right. You want equal energy coming from your left side as you do your right side. So energy that comes off the left speaker comes back to you at the same time energy from the right speaker comes back to you. In this scenario over here on the right side, you've got early reflection coming off the wall here, but then the reflection back here would have to bounce around and wouldn't come back to the mixed position at the same time as the left reflection would. And so it's always good to have symmetry at the mixed position where your speakers in your listening position is.
Sure.
Okay, one more example. If you're playing at home and you're 1 for 2 or whatever, this is the tiebreaker. Okay, this is where you can if you're guessing which one is correct. So on this one, we've got a rectangular room on the left, and then we have an angled wall on the right. And one quick note, too, if you are angling walls, you want the sum of those angles to be at least about 10 to 12 degrees to make a difference. If it's less than 10 to 12 degrees as far as the difference between the two angles, then you still end up with flutter echo and some of the same problems you would have in a rectangular room. Sure. But so left side, we've got a rectangular room. Right side, we have the right side angled wall. Which one do you think, Ryan? Putting you on the spot.
Yeah, I'm going to go with the left one.
I knew that you worked here for a reason. So yeah, the reason the left side is the chosen one here is that, again, it's symmetry. You don't want reflections on this right version here. The reflections off of this sidewall is angled and go to the back of the room, but the reflections off the left sidewall would come back to the mixed position. And so you want symmetry. Now it's an angle. People throw angles in all the time and hey, I just don't want a rectangular room. But in this case, it actually makes it worse. The other thing that this one on the right side doesn't do well is that the back corner is an acute angle, so it's less than 90 degrees. And acute angles, low frequencies actually build up more in those corners than they would just a standard 90-degree corner or an obtuse angle. And so usually what we'll do if we are angling our walls is that we'll get to a certain point and then we'll square it off. Sure. And then we can bass trap these corners and not have an acute angle. Right. But so this is an example of the rectangular room not being so bad in comparison to something that is more haphazardly designed.
Sure.
Yeah.
So that wraps up this episode. Room ratios and dimensions are so important. It really helps take care of a lot of things at the source. Do you have any last minute comments?
Yeah, I would just say that we just scratched the surface of this. Like there's so much that goes into the room ratios and the room shape. I would say that, kind of researching on your own, or also like reaching out to us and getting some tips and techniques on how to design your room. We spend a lot of our time designing layouts for rooms in a more basic level before we go into the full detail of designing a studio, because that layout is so important. And sometimes we'll go through 6, 7, 8 layouts of a facility to get sight lines correct, to get the room dimensions correct. And it's important to kind of measure twice, cut once. Right. It's like get that design to where it's as good as possibly can be, and then you can start to go through all the other details that are a little bit more fun. But the layout is just it's the one thing that after construction starts you can't change. Right. It's like, well, you can, but it'll be really expensive. So it's important to get that off to the right start, and it'll just make your studio all that much better.
Sure.
Yeah.
And this is something too that we'll kind of take this to the next level in a future episode, talking more in depth about room modes then too.
Yeah. That is because once you have arrived at a size of room or whatever you've been given, then it really gets down to, all right, what acoustical issues do I have? Why are they happening? And how can I combat that? So we'll go over that in a future episode.
Great.
Well, that's it for this episode. Thanks so much for being part of the S.O.U.N.D project. We'll see you next week. And if you have any ideas for future episodes, feel free to email us at info@haverstickdesigns.com or comment below. And we will see you next Monday.